Good morning. I'm Ellen Richstone, and I'm a board member and the chair of the NACD New England Programming Committee. Today's joint program with our partners of the NACD Philadelphia chapter is on the hot topics for the upcoming 2024 Proxy season, which will provide our kickoff for the new year. Both of our organizations would like to thank you all for joining us today. Before we get started, we have a couple of housekeeping items. First, a reminder to remain muted throughout the program and to use the chat function to pose questions. No need to wait until the Q&A portion of the event to submit questions. We will monitor the chat box during the panel discussion and intersperse the questions as they come up. Next, we know that many of you want to receive credits for the program. To receive credit, we need to know your first and last name. Please make sure that your full name is visible on your Zoom window. If you are on this call via phone, send an email to Deb Rosenthal so that you receive credit. Finally, the panelists and moderator statements and opinions are their own and not the companies with which they work. I would be remiss if I did not thank all our chapter sponsors of both New England and Philadelphia. The continued loyalty of these organizations underscores the important role of NACD. It is their support that allows us to fulfill our mission of delivering world-class, director-centric, local programming, and peer-to-peer sharing of insights that is vital to advancing excellence in the boardroom. Today, we are highlighting two very special sponsors, Pay Governance and Black Rome, who have continued to support both the New England and Philadelphia chapters in their mission of excellence in corporate governance education. Thank you for your support. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Gloria Larson. Gloria is a respected public company director, an outstanding public company director, a lawyer, public policy expert, Boston business leader, and former Bentley University president. I will now turn it over to Gloria.
Thank you so much, Ellen. And I'm thrilled to be here and especially excited to introduce today's panelists. First, you have their bios, so this is going to be a very quick summary, but Yelena Barachev is a partner at Black Rome, where she co-leads the firm's Environmental, Social, and Governance team, or ESG team. Audrey Bout is a managing partner in the Boston office of Pay Governance and also serves on the firm's leadership committee. And Kevin Cabot is the former CEO and chairman of the Bank of Fifth Third Bank Corp and currently serves as board chair of two public companies, Unum Group and NiSource. So I thought I would start today with a very quick summary of the 2023 proxy season. It was an especially interesting season marked by several seemingly contradictory things. On the one hand, 2023 yielded a record number of shareholder proposals, with a majority focused on environmental and social issues. And then on the other hand, shareholder support declined overall, and it literally dropped off the cliff for those climate and social proposals. Perhaps a reflection of growing shareholder caution in the face of increasing anti-ESG proposals, which also enjoyed very little support. With respect to executive comp, 2023 ushered in the SEC's new pay versus performance disclosure requirements, as well as greater scrutiny of severance agreements by activist investors. Shareholder support increased for Say on Pay, while support for individual director nominees continued to edge down. And while many had predicted the new universal proxy rules would lead to more contested director elections, the first year saw relatively little use of the new proxy card, marked instead by an increase in company settlements that gave activists a board seat. But this is a brand new year and a brand new proxy season, and today's panel is going to focus with a laser-like beam on the 2024 road ahead. They're going to offer their thoughts on new and forthcoming SEC disclosure requirements, what to expect from the increasingly choppy ESG waters, top of mind executive comp matters as the SEC starts to slow its issuance of new rules after 2 very busy years. And we'll offer several other thoughts about the evolving proxy season trends that really deserve careful watch by directors. So, Yelena, I want to start with you and our favorite starting topic, the SEC and new rules. They passed at long last the new disclosure rules regarding cybersecurity risk management strategy, governance, and cyber incidents. And interesting to me, I saw the recent NACD survey of board directors asking what are the top concerns you have going into the 24 proxy season. And cybersecurity was ranked number 3. So I think it would be great if you could give a quick summary of what the rule requirements are, how that impacts board oversight, and also when you think about the proxy itself, although not required by the SEC to disclose discussion there, perhaps you could give a quick primer on the kinds of disclosures that really would be suited there for investors to see, since that's the likely place they'll be turning to.
Thank you so much, Gloria. I will be happy to do that. And thank you very much for everybody who decided to join this program at 7:30 in the morning. We promise you a very riveting discussion of all these rules and keep you awake for all this time. So what I like about the recent SEC rules, that if you look at the heading, if you look at the title of the rules, you already sort of know what it's going to be about. It's a mouthful, but it describes it all. So if you look at the heading of the new rules, it's cybersecurity risk management, strategy, governance, and incident disclosure. And that's exactly what it is about. So if you ever forget what it is, just look at the title. It's generally into buckets. So you have the new 8K requirement to disclose material cybersecurity incidents within 4 business days after determining that the incident was material. And discussion of materiality is interesting in and of itself. And the second requirement is to disclose information about, again, cybersecurity risk management, strategy, governance, but now in Form 10K, not in a proxy statement, in Form 10K, and in Part 1 of Form 10K, which is not usually incorporated by reference. So disclosures that we normally see in a proxy statement about policies, procedures, about governance will now appear in Form 10K, in the ones that are being prepared now for the companies that have a fiscal year end, like December 31 fiscal year end. So this is front and center for a lot of companies that are in the proxy season now. And the right question that you asked, Gloria, is what is the dichotomy going to be between the proxy disclosures and Form 10K disclosures? Quite frankly, I think when you start drafting your 10K disclosures, you need to open up the proxy statement. You need to look at what you have already disclosed and grow from there, because most of these issues have probably been already addressed. Your policies, your procedures, your oversight over cybersecurity risk management probably has been already thought through by the company. So first of all, they cannot be inconsistent with what you have disclosed before. But then you look at the specific requirements related to Form 10K, and that's an item 106 of Regulation SK, and you try sort of like blow by blow, if you will, to address them. Some of the early samples of that are already on EDGAR. Some companies have filed their 10Ks with that disclosure, sometimes voluntarily, because their fiscal year ends early on September 30, but they wanted to provide these disclosures on a voluntary basis. A lot of them, quite frankly, and probably unfortunately, look like boilerplate. But I hope that companies look at them with a critical eye and think through the actual practical implications of cybersecurity for their company, as opposed to just copying and pasting, if you will. The interesting piece is about governance. So normally, governance disclosures for companies focus on the boards and what the board of directors does and how the oversight develops. This time, you will have to think through the governance at the management level and disclose the expertise of your management personnel who is responsible for cybersecurity matters, and see how they are getting information about cybersecurity risks and how they're transferring that information, if you will, to the board. So what the SEC is interesting about is not only the board level of oversight, but the interaction, if you will, with management and how the information flows up and down, how it's gathered, how management finds out about cybersecurity incident, and how it goes up to the board, and how then it goes down in terms of oversight. It's really important to figure out which committee is going to be responsible for that, because a lot of constituencies are focused on cybersecurity matters and are going, quite frankly, to hold the committee that has that responsibility responsible for the incidents. And directors may be voted against if a cybersecurity incident happens. For example, Les Lewis indicated that. So there are a lot of interesting implications in this disclosure. And materiality, going back to Form 8K requirement, becomes front and center. It's not an easy determination. It's one of the most difficult determinations in securities laws, because there is no black letter law on that. It's whatever is important for the reasonable investor in the total mix of information. And when the SEC thinks about materiality, it's not only a quantitative determination, it's also a qualitative determination. So it may not be financially material for the company, but it may affect its reputation. It may lead to a lot of lawsuits. And from that standpoint, it will be material. I'll stop there because I can talk about cybersecurity for hours.
Yeah, Kevin?
Elena, I had a question for you in terms of your perspective. Many of us and many of the boards today are on calendar year and probably haven't had yet a 10K opportunity in the space that you talked about.
Yeah.
What would you recommend in alignment of an upcoming proxy without a 10K event, so you don't get boxed in? So I'm concerned about that alignment between what you say in the proxy and what you say in a 10K. How would you recommend boards look at that?
That's an excellent question. But for a December 31 company, for a calendar year company, you will have your proxy you will have your 10K first, and then you will have the proxy statement. So you will start with your 10K disclosure, and then you will transition to your proxy statement disclosure. So I think it will work in reverse this year. So for the most companies that have disclosed cybersecurity oversight, and rightfully so in their proxy statements, they will have to start with that disclosure, think about it, and think how they will transplant that and enhance that in the 10K. Because before it was all voluntary, right? So you disclose whatever you wanted to disclose about cybersecurity risk oversight. And now the SEC prescribes you in its regulation SK how they envision that disclosure to unfold.
Yelena, we're going to talk a little bit later about the increasing scrutiny on boards and individual directors with respect to their overall and specific expertise. And I'm wondering if you could just offer a quick comment about what to do with, that's kind of like a hanging participle. The SEC left out from their draft rule the requirement that boards have a cyber expert on the board. Could you just comment quickly on that? Because I'm confident the SEC still believes you should have cyber expertise, and clearly investors do too. I mean, that's something that they have, especially large scale investors have raised this point regularly.
Thank you. It's an excellent question. Thank you so much for raising it. I believe they left it out because there was a lot of pushback on that, a lot of comments on that point, because from a broader picture, big picture standpoint, you don't necessarily want to have a board of directors that is a board of experts, if you will, in very sort of like finite minor areas. I don't want to say that cybersecurity is minor, but you want your board to be sort of generalists. You want your board to be experts in doing business, if you will, not necessarily experts in climate, experts in cybersecurity, or experts in every little thing where you can actually hire experts who will tell you all about it. You want the board to be people who can evaluate the situation and guide management how to overcome an obstacle, because each time the obstacle will be different. So that was the reason probably why they pulled it back. Now, if we talk about the board expertise, if you have somebody on the board who is a cybersecurity expert, absolutely point it out, because it will be really important, not just for the purposes of disclosure. It will be really important to highlight the individual contributions that a board member can make And it will be important when we talk about the universal proxy cards and the proxy fights and the focus on the individual directors and what each individual director contributes to the board. The value of the expertise, the value of what that director brings is becoming critical if you want to win these fights. So if you have that expert, absolutely highlight it. It's really important. But if you don't have that expert, you don't necessarily have to rush and hire that or try to get that person for the board.
Thanks, Yelena. I'm going to turn to you and Aubrey to talk about SEC current executive comp rules, one new one. But before we go to that, I'd like it if you could kind of give a glancing blow to two things that are on the horizon for the SEC. And one, of course, would be the delayed climate rule and how boards might handle that, knowing that it's coming. Big companies are using SASB and TCFD frameworks more and more, but there's still no universal standards. And how should boards be thinking about that with this proxy season, knowing that it may come out but not be effective, obviously, this year, and may be followed by lawsuits? And then if you could also talk a little bit too about the human capital management rules that are already, principle based and have allowed sort of a crazy quilt of different disclosures by companies, but they're now looking again at the need for more specific metrics driven standards that they might impose somewhere along the line, and have announced that as a future rulemaking. So if you could comment on those as in more of a what do we do now, knowing with bated breath for what's going to come out in more required format.
So the SEC has been very active in rulemaking and put out a lot of rules. Not everything obviously is on the books yet as a proposed rule, and not every proposed rule has been adopted. So climate change is sort of the famous, you can say famous or notorious, depending on which side you're on, elephant in the room, because they proposed these rules, the SEC proposed these rules in March of 2022, and everybody waited whole 2023 when the rules will be adopted. That hasn't happened. Now it's on the agenda for April 2024. We'll see if it happens. It's a very politically charged year, so it's not entirely clear to me whether any side would pick it, if you will, as the campaign topic and how it will transpire. So we may see these rules actually being adopted. So people who advocate for the adoption of the climate change rules say that if they're adopted, they're going to be adopted this spring because it makes sense politically to do it earlier in the year. People who are not in favor of these rules say, everybody will be on sidelines and nobody will touch this topic, and we'll just wait for the European legislation, if you will, to pick up the burden of bringing U.S. companies into the fold, if you will. Human capital management hasn't been even proposed yet. And it's on the agenda also for April of 2024. But the reality is that these disclosures are already trickling into the documents, into the SEC filings. And I love to talk about the voluntary disclosures in the SEC filings, which have expanded over the years, mainly because of peer pressure from your institutional shareholders, pressure from proxy advisory firms. So I think when companies are thinking about their disclosures, the SEC rules is obviously a very important point, but what your peers are doing is also very important. So if you are the only company in your peer group which is not disclosing your workforce data, you may be an outlier, not in a good way. So you may want to rethink your position. At the same time, the SEC advisory group basically recommended to the SEC when they adopt these rules this spring, or propose these rules this spring, to actually propose these metrics and talk in a very discrete way about the workforce, not only full-time and part-time, but also the equity pay, about the racial spread, if you will, of the workforce. Whether it will be adopted that way or even proposed that way, who knows? But a lot of companies are already doing it that way. And I think that's what's really important. You need to see what the general law of the land is in terms of what everybody is doing. So for example, when the human capital management disclosure was adopted in 2020 for the business section of the 10K, the first year that it got out, maybe one paragraph, maybe two paragraphs of each company, very boilerplate. And then the next 2 years, that disclosure has grown exponentially. And everybody is using it, quite frankly, now, what I often say, for PR purposes, because they want to advertise how good the human capital management is at their company. And they talk a lot about the recruitment programs or programs related to their investment in the workforce. So the SEC rules more and more are becoming what I call principles-based. So they give you the idea, they give you the point that needs to be disclosed, and then the companies run with it, and they sometimes want to outrun the competitor. So when you think about the disclosure, we can never be limited by what the SEC requires. We should always look at the full landscape of the stakeholders who influence that disclosure.
You know, when I used to practice law as opposed to being a recovering attorney, now we thought about those as safe harbor approaches by regulators as opposed to command and control. And it's sort of interesting to see, because the SEC does use command and control where they think it's an imperative. And at the same time, this does look like one of those opportunities for companies to look as closely at what their peers are doing as what the SEC might likely do. So let me now turn to some important comp rules that have entered the world in 24. And the first, of course, is the SEC, and the newest one is the clawback rule. And so, Elaine, I want to start with you, but Aubrey may have some comments to add to that to describe those requirements. It was actually approved by the SEC, I think, in 22, but of course it awaited NASDAQ and New York Stock Exchange policies coming into play. Those were ready this fall, and companies, I think, as of December, need to comply in this going forward with this new proxy season.
So I would bet that every company on the board of which you sit has already adopted a clawback policy, because it was supposed to happen by December 1st of last year. The 10Ks that are coming out this year, you would need to attach or link to that policy as an exhibit. So it will be disclosed. A lot of companies have already disclosed these policies on their website. This is the Dodd-Frank, I don't know, vestige, if you will, that we got. And the SEC for they proposed that rule many years ago, almost a decade ago, and for a very long time did not adopt it because it was very controversial. It is still controversial. And the basic requirement is that the board would need to claw back compensation from executives, no matter whether it's at the point of the clawback, whether it's a current executive officer or a former executive officer, going back 3 years before they decided that there should be a restatement, even though there is no misconduct on the part of the executive. And even though it's what's called a little R statement, right? That doesn't trigger the big R statement, doesn't trigger any 8K disclosures. So it's an extremely controversial rule. But what's interesting about it is that a lot of constituencies are going even further down that road. And for example, if you look at Glass Lewis policy recommendations for this proxy season, they want companies to claw back not only if there is a misstatement, if there is a restatement of financial statements, but also if there is some kind of misconduct, which may have nothing to do to reporting or financial statements. It's a very interesting development, and it's really difficult to implement that, quite frankly, because what companies need to think through is how they're going to actually get that compensation. It's easy to write it on paper. It's really difficult to implement it. So there may be deferral plans, there may be some other creative solutions, but it will be a real practical problem. And on top of that, companies would need to disclose on their Forms 10K or incorporate by reference from the proxy statement if they haven't been able to claw something back, and the amounts and why and how. So it's a really complicated process, and I think companies need to be very thoughtful when they think about the implementation. Policy is easy because, quite frankly, for a lot of companies, it's boilerplate, right? You say in the policy that we will claw back, but how will you do that? It's not in the policy, and all the devil is always in the details.
So Aubrey, this is what you're saying with your clients?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's definitely controversial. I think the way to look at it was, if this rule was put in place a few years when the labor market was in 21, we had executives and certain management saying, you're going to have to pay me to offset such a hard clawback, right? As the market softened, those comments in 23 kind of mostly dissipated. And the comments were like, wow, I mean, we have the SEC required rule, but, do we have to go beyond it? And most of our large cap clients kept their original policies in, and they kind of overlaid us on. So there's some companies that had 2 policies, some just had 1 with the newer one in. It was definitely controversial. To the point that Glass-Lewis policy really says the recruitment policy should provide companies with the ability to claw back variable incentives where there's evidence of problematic decisions or actions such as material misconduct, material reputational failure, material risk management failure, and material operational failure. It's very, very, very broad, right? So I think what we've seen so far in the recent proxies coming out, Glass-Lewis will highlight in their kind of negative thing as a weak clawback because they're restatement dependent only. Glass-Lewis says this policy may play a role in overall recommendations on, say, on pay. It's still early. We haven't seen it tip the scales yet. I think the company's going to have many pay and performance problems and potential practices before a clawback could actually kind of tip the scales. We have not seen that. So it's definitely controversial. Companies are kind of moving on. I mean, for those of us who worked in financial services on boards, those are the examples of where clawbacks have actually been used at a large scale. And board of directors know the importance of those clawback provisions, right? It is completely, the whole clawback provisions and the risk culture and the risk structure. And, and Kevin, you were in those roles, you know how important it is having that. And employees and executives know it's real, right? Now this is coming to the broader corporate America, and it'll be seen how much it's needed, right? But there's not a lot of experience with it, but the experience comes from the financial services sector, basically the banks.
One thing that I wanted to add to make sure that everybody is aware, you cannot indemnify your executive offices for this. You cannot get insurance. The company cannot get insurance for this. Individual executive offices can get insured. And I think that these products are being developed by some companies now, but the company cannot reimburse them for that. So it will be interesting to see what market develops, if you will, and how executives will be trying to protect themselves. One interesting thing that I would love you to think about is that you're required to claw back for incentive-based compensation. And incentive-based compensation is the one which is triggered by certain financial measures, including the stock price. So all this time we've been working for executives to be mindful of the performance of the company, right? But right now, when you have bonuses or non-equity compensation plans triggered by EBITDA or some other financial metrics, that's what can be clawback. But if your compensation committee gets together and says, oh, Brian did a really good job and Marcia did a wonderful job, why don't we give them a bonus without being tied to any of these financial metrics? This is not something that can be clawed back under the rules. So I wonder if it will trigger the fallback from these pay-for-performance policies. And companies will try to structure their compensation arrangements in a completely different way. So it's sort of like the unintended consequences of rulemaking.
Thank you for that.
The reality with that is, because the proxy advised investors, the pressures on say on pay, that's the other conflicting piece, right?
Right.
And directors in certain industries, there is more kind of balanced scorecard, non-formulaic, and every year they have to go through the proxy advisors and kind of some of those things through it. But I think that's a balancing tension, and I think the pay and performance and formulaic. Directors want formulas, right? I mean, no, directors don't want blind discretion. No one really wants that in today's world. So I think, I think if we have a lot of clawbacks happening and there's a strong labor market, you could see some of that, but I think the momentum switches back and forth to directors having powers, management having powers, right? And it depends where you're on that spectrum. But right now, I think, it's in the background, right? Until you see some more of these issues happening.
So Aubrey, you've now had, as have all your company clients, a year under their belts with the pay versus performance disclosure rules. And I'm wondering if you could give a quick snapshot of what that first year experience was for companies and what we could expect possibly from Proxy Advisors guidance this coming year around their voting policies. Because maybe last year wasn't enough experience, but now they're looking at this going, aha, opportunity.
Yeah, well, listen, last year was plenty of experience for some of us who were in the trenches, right? So
I bet.
I think, as we call it, the pay versus PVP disclosures were first mandated as, in 23 proxy season. 24 will be the second year of it for year-end companies. It brought this new definition of compensation actually paid. So you'll hear that term CAP, for compensation actually paid, for the CEO and its other proxy named executives. It's a complex calculation. It's a summary comp table equity that's accounting, and then you're really adjusting for the fair value of the equity in those years and give it kind of in the money values and mark to market, right? It's quite a complex accounting calculation. Intuitively, because equity our executive comp is so tied to equity, you see the vast majority of the company, if their TSR and performance is good, the compensation actually paid a positive. At the same point, when you saw a lot of TSRs going down year over year, you saw some big negatives, right? So it kind of it works from that perspective, but really it's kind of faded to a back of the table proxy, right? The investors are kind of glancing at it. The proxy advisors cross-reference it, right? For 24, what's interesting, right? They call it, compliance and disclosure in CDIs. There were 32 Q&A questions raised, right? That you would hope that most directors did not study them, right? Very, very detailed, really for the accountants and consultants to kind of model them out. But these questions are going to be going through the system, and most people, I think it's going to be pretty much a non-event this year on PVP, because basically last year it showed that the vast majority of the companies had aligned pay, up performance, high cap, down performance, low cap, right? So that was really the messaging there. And, ISS and Glassdoor will continue to cross-reference these tables. But as you said, I think it's going to be less scrutinized. It's only when someone's off aligned, when you have high performance and something's negative. But really what people are looking for is the low performance and how do they get a cap, positive cap, right? And the only way you could really do that is have to give a lot of restricted stock, right? And that's, everyone kind of knows how you can go offside on those, right? So I think it won't be a whole lot of news in this on the PVP front.
Kevin, before we leave this area, it was interesting to me to see that when NACD surveyed directors, they found that number 2 on their list after economic concerns going into 24 was this tsunami wave of regulatory impacts for every company. Clearly regulated industry sectors with which you are very familiar, but broader sectors which you're also familiar with some of these rules. And I'm wondering what you think about with your boards about how to best use the proxy. But I'd also like to bring in the idea of your major shareholders and engagement, and how this is a platform for explaining some of how boards are thinking through the risks associated with all of this and handling it as a board.
Yeah, it's a good question, Gloria. And what we've seen just in the past, let's say 18 months, 24 months, is an explosion of new regulatory impacts. One of the companies I work with quoted that they've had over 231 different new regulations in the past 18 months. Just tremendous amount of burden in terms of the company and in terms of really governance and management over those new issues. So, as we think about it and as we've kind of looked at it, it really goes back to a broader framework of how you look at this. And we talk about the proxy and proxy season that's become highlighted and more important than ever in terms of what we actually disclose and what we do. But it's also expanded then to full year engagement. And it really goes to all of the stakeholders. And think about it in terms of not just your federal regulators, but think about it from your state regulators, because we have now states in a much different position relative to the application of any federal or broadly proposed rules. And it can be quite significant in terms of the differences relative to compliance that you have. So you've really got to kind of take all of that into consideration, have a framework to be able to really cover the watershed, if you will. And it's really, I always keep in mind that you really want to keep all of your stakeholders in mind. We get that. But I think Aubrey said it best. You really start with the overall performance of the company. TSR, stock price, that matters. Everything else can be cloudy and everything else can be a little bit, if that's in good stead, you typically don't see it really evolve into something worse or something more compelling for change or for management or for change. But I think that in doing so, you really need a framework that you're going out to your regulators, you're going out to your constituents, particularly your shareholders, in a much more often and regular way, communicating directly with them and finding out really what they feel, what their takeaway is, what their perspectives are. And you also learn a lot. I mean, that's a two-way street, right? Particularly when you talk to some of your largest shareholders, you learn what the rest of the world is doing, and you learn from their perspective of what they've invested in, and they give you feedback about what competitors are or peers are doing that you should be considering relative to best practices. So I really do think it's something that has to be put into a very broad framework of communications and direct interactions with the key stakeholders, just as a hygiene practice to really keep the company in good stead.
I think that's particularly helpful. Before I turn the page, which I'm going to Ellen, any related to SEC, state regulation, the tsunami wave, anything that you would add by way of questions from our audience?
Nothing particularly. There's been an interesting side discussion about the usefulness of the NACD cyber certificate and the comment. So there was a question how important it was, and the couple of responses are just to encourage people that it is a useful process and can help people to stay current.
That's terrific advice. Thank you. So I want to move on to something that really every single year, what we're talking about, I think directly reflects this, and that's this additional scrutiny on boards themselves and on individual directors. And nothing spoke more about that kind of increased focus than the introduction of the universal proxy card, because that's exactly what it brings to the forefront. And Elena, just really quickly, I'd love for you to touch on, we saw last year that there wasn't this huge movement to use the card itself, but I thought a really interesting aspect of the data showed, particularly as the year progressed, that more and more companies, still a modest number, but more companies were settling. I mean, it meant they were engaging rather than going to war. And I'm sort of wondering what you foresee this year now that we roll into year 2 of the universal proxy card.
Thank you for this question. I think it's really important to watch what's happening during the proxy season, and not always what happened in the prior proxy season is an indication of what will happen in the next one, unfortunately, as much as we want it to be predictable. But the universal proxy card brings a really interesting dilemma for both sides, right? So The core of this requirement is that the company nominees for director and dissidents or activist shareholder nominees for director are on the same card. So there is no longer that sort of like battle of, I don't know, the white card is the company's card or the blue card is the company's card and the dissident's card is a different color and only vote the white card, but don't vote the card of the other color. All that nonsense, if you will, is out of the door. And everybody gets one card with all candidates. But it may be problematic. It may be problematic for both sides, because then these candidates are sort of like side by side. And in the proxy statement, their bias are side by side. And the shareholders, the retail shareholders, if you will, or even institutional shareholders, can look at that and say, oh, maybe that candidate from the activist shareholder slate looks really good for this company. It makes sense. They have a lot of experience in this area, or maybe they're a cybersecurity expert, or maybe they're a climate change expert. Why not? So I think the tendency to settle on both sides is because each side sees the vulnerability. The company sees the possibility that some of these activist shareholders nominees will get elected. And the activist shareholder understands that some of its candidates may not be as strong as they would want them to be. So it's really, it has an interesting effect that actually brings both sides to the negotiation table. Quite frankly, when I see companies fight really hard, I always have a question in my mind, to what end? Because sometimes when you win, you lose, right? Because you've exposed so much of your underbelly, if you will, and so much of information about the company that your shareholders become questioning your policies anyway. And oftentimes after winning a proxy fight, the company gets sold because again, it showed a lot of vulnerability of that company. So negotiating with the from my point of view, negotiating with the activist shareholder is probably the best strategy. But it also reflects the fact that I'm a transactional lawyer, right? So I like people to talk to each other. I like them to negotiate. I'm not a litigator. So maybe if you get a litigator in the room, you will get a different advice. But when you get a proposal from a shareholder, a lot of times the first thing that companies do, they go back to that shareholder and they ask that shareholder, what would it take for you to take that proposal back? What can we implement? What can we change? What policies can we adopt to make sure that you're happy? So negotiation is actually a very fruitful exercise. It doesn't always produce that effect. So sometimes they have different agendas. Sometimes they want to highlight the issue that has nothing to do with the election of directors or having the board that's really thoughtful about oversight. For example, in Starbucks, the campaign was about unionizing the company. And the shareholder that brought the slate of 3 directors owns less than 1%. So again, like situations differ, but I think the first analysis should be, what can we do to negotiate? Because I think when you negotiate and actually have a settlement with the activist shareholder, both sides win at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm wondering how you think about this in the context of, say, a company like Disney, where you might have dueling hedge funds looking for board seats, and obviously a more complex situation.
Well, I mean, not every situation lends itself to that model. I realize that, but I think that what's happening at Disney is also more of an outlier. That not every company would attract so much attention, quite frankly, that there will be multiple activists fighting for the agenda there. So I wouldn't necessarily use it as a model for every particular situation.
Yeah, and
but it's interesting. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying it's an interesting case where state elected officials have played a role in making it a really interesting target.
Right, but again, if we look at the big picture, like I think you always have to think, who are you fighting, right? So the board exists as a fiduciary for shareholders. So a lot of times when they advocate, they say, you spent so much money on this fight instead of spending money on the operations of the company, but you wasted essentially your money on fighting with your own shareholders. The counter argument to that is, for example, when the proxy access rules were introduced into the bylaws by the private order, right, through the shareholder proposals, those rules essentially settled around the idea that only shareholders that own approximately 3% of the company. It varies from company to company, but sort of like the median, own 3% of the company for 3 years can introduce their slate. In this case, you can have shareholders who own, I don't know, a couple of shares introduce their slate. So there are pros and cons, if you will, to the universal proxy card phenomenon. But at the end of the day, when you're fighting it, when you're trying to have this aggressive reaction, if you will, to shareholder proposals, it can backfire.
Kevin, I want to follow up with this discussion of the universal proxy sort of has put in the clique lights this idea of individual director scrutiny as well as full board. And I'm wondering if we could segue into that as a broader discussion area, because it would be, first of all, think about board diversity. And the focus has been on that from any number of fronts for quite a while now, certainly starting with gender and race and ethnicity. It's becoming broader and broader in terms of, yes, those are baselines, and certainly the big Fortune 100 and beyond have great statistics more and more around gender and racial and ethnic diversity. At the same time, mid-cap and smaller companies are often still struggling to meet that baseline goal. But I also think that companies broadly are thinking more and more about what is diversity of perspective and how do you start to put the pieces of the mosaic together in ways that our shareholders would appreciate. Yes, we are focused on these baseline issues and doing our best because we know it reflects our employees, our customers, our communities, and the views of big investors. At the same time, diversity is becoming more nuanced and what that brings to each board. And so I know it sounds like I'm asking you for a blue book answer, but
You won't get it.
I knew I wouldn't. So what is your thought about that, about sort of this idea that diversity of perspective, because that almost brings you to these things as a more natural course rather than sort of a Noah's Ark approach?
Yeah, I the way that we have thought about it in the boards that I'm involved in, and it really goes back to Elena's point, which is principles become really important. And so what I'd say is board succession planning today is as important as CEO succession planning has been. And that's really kind of, risen that, had that boat rise. And that board should be paying a lot more attention to that. They should be more focused in terms of stepping back, because the data is available. We know what peers do. We know both in our own comparatives as well as industry comparatives of where performance lies. And so you can actually build then kind of a proactive modeling of what it is you'd like to be when you achieve the goals you set and determine for the board to be. And once you do that, then you can very specifically look at all of the other things that come to play, like what are your refreshment policies and practices? Because if you don't have them, getting to that end point is a very difficult process. And so it begins to kind of fold back into the things we've seen show up now in proxy proposals more and more over the last few years of, what your refreshment practices are, tenure, et cetera, and age, and what you're doing about those. But again, I think that you just need to be mindful on looking at what your board is today, what it is you think defining it to be. And that's not only diversity related issues, but it's also skill related issues or experience related issues. You have to look at it holistically. And I think if you can do that, then you can articulate very well in a defensive way before someone knocks on your door that you've got an issue or a problem or a challenge, what you're trying to accomplish and how you're trying to accomplish it from that standpoint. So I think that really is kind of the approach that we've taken. And quite frankly, we in some of our boards, we did that 5-7 years ago, and we've made a lot of progress in that time frame. And we can talk about that and do talk about that when we meet annually with our largest shareholders about what we principally put together in definition of success. and what we've practically done over that time frame. And I think, again, that gives you good stead to be able to do that. Ultimately, though, I agree with Elena. You get someone knocking on the door, you're going to talk to them, and you're going to find out what the issues are before you come to any conclusions.
And I think that point leads you back to some of the baseline statistics really do matter. It's just that that's not the whole story if you're being thoughtful about it. And I like the way very much that you've framed that. And I wonder if you could then take that down to the individual director level, because how do you take that set of, offensive moves really and put them into play around, you mentioned board refreshment, but beyond that, the skills matrices, the overboarding for some directors, just there's a whole group of things that investors are looking at, as well as a number of regulators. And how do you think through the best way to display that? I've actually heard you describe something that I call your Goldilocks rule, because you do have to watch what you're sharing and how you're sharing it appropriately, obviously transparently, but you could end up going in a crazy direction if you took this principle too far.
Right. It goes to Elena's point, which is how much of your underbelly would you like to expose?
Exactly.
Right. And the skill matrix can do that, right? So if you look at that, that's a great example, in my opinion, about the debates that go on within boards today, which is you look at the skill matrix and you debate then how deep do you want to go or disclose what it is specifically you're targeting, recognizing that you may have a different perspective from the shareholders that you're arguing with or that are scrutinizing your skill matrix. And what does that look like relative to the outcomes that you have from that standpoint? And that's a challenge a lot of boards have. And to your point, Gloria, the kind of the mid-cap companies are really looking at that very hard in terms of trying to determine how deep to go from that standpoint. So I think, on an individual level, again, that's where I get a little bit concerned, because from my standpoint, board work is teamwork. And so you really have to look at a board. Yes, there are individual skills, and yes, you've got to have a justification for an individual director and the recruitment of and onboarding of that director, but it should be, again, housed within the principle of what the full board dynamic objectives and principles are that you're looking for. And if you can do that, you can at least then have a story that you can explain to investors about what your strategy is and about what you're doing from that standpoint. It gets more difficult when you start selecting out individuals, and that is how they attack. Elena, I'm sure you'd say that's how they attack all the time, is they'll look at individual skill sets and they'll pick out the weakest links individually to really go after from that standpoint. But it's got to be within the web of, what were the principles and what we were trying to accomplish in terms of the board as a whole.
So, Ellen, I'm going to move on to another way in which boards are being heavily scrutinized, and that's with growing anti-environmental and social sentiments from shareholders and other parties, regulators in some states, elected officials. Before we do that, is there anything specific in this area of direct board and individual scrutiny, and how you best display your best case?
No, but I think there's a highlight from Melissa that kind of referenced one of the conversations we had during prep. Kevin's comment about how boards need to be the first activist at the table.
Yeah.
So just a reminder of that point.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Kevin. You might make that for the audience.
Yeah, the comment as we were discussing was really around how does the board, and it really goes to the challenging impact of a board. And I've always used the term that the board should be your first activist at the table, which really means the hygiene and governance evaluations that you do and that you have embedded within practice in order to make sure that you're kind of the first ones that have a clue as to where your weaknesses are and what are the things and strengths, as well as what it is you could potentially be tacked on from that standpoint. If you do that, and you have a practice and a framework with which to do that, you'll always be, I think, a step ahead of the game. And the best example from my standpoint is that, there are practices that years ago, 5 years or a decade ago, we all in our boards put into place with experts like Yelena giving us best practices at the time. Those change over time. And while those may have been best practices 5 years ago, 10 years ago, today, you may be in the minority. And that's indefensible to many stakeholders, whether they're an activist or not. And hearing that can really kind of change their orientation around your governance and how actively you actually look at and refresh your policies and practices so that, again, you're current and that you're in the mainstream of the environment that we're all participating in today. And that's what we mean by really testing the limits, being the first activist at the table in being prepared for potentially challenges that you may get.
Well, one of those prime examples currently of being your own best advocate, your own best activist out of the box before they come knocking is this growing anti-ESG, ENS, I should clarify, sentiment. Still not political, to be focused on governance issues largely, but the ENS have definitely taken, we're seeing and entering a presidential divisive year as we are, that's election year. We're just likely to see this sentiment grow, and different boards are taking different approaches, maybe changing the way they talk about the ENS, changing the way some of their reporting is done, and some actually changing some practices. But it's really interesting to balance as a board. And I want to just focus on two areas, one being climate and the other being DEI. And I think I'm going to start, Aubrey, with DEI because it's not clear how you can best discuss in your proxy what you're doing in ways that don't automatically politicize the conversation. And since we're seeing boards handle it differently, and we're also seeing the criticism mount in terms of, coming in directions that previously you would not have thought about from members of Congress, clearly elected state officials. And we had started to take in many companies for granted, I'll say, that part of ENS was making sure that these essential elements, being climate, carbon reduction, being a focus on DEI, were part of your long-term strategy around long-term sustainability, around value creation. So how are you seeing, let's start with DEI, because the pushback, and particularly given the Harvard case, universities and colleges, has implications. And hearing how you're discussing this with your clients and how they're treating this year's proxy versus maybe how they handled the issues a year ago.
It's a very timely question. I think one of the questions in the chat was talking about one of their board members' companies removing the DEI policies, and trying to avoid a potential lawsuit. So it's timely, right? I think, I started seeing in my clients the summer after, as you said, the Harvard case started coming out, how applicable it was, and encourage them saying, hey, let's get your law firms plugged in, and strike a balance of what's your litigation risk, but kind of go eyes wide open. And what's been interesting, I have diverse path companies have taken. I think the vast majority have gotten outside counsel viewpoints. Some are pursuing their agendas on D&I because that's core cultural values. But what's consistent is between 24 and 23 is companies are more cautious about setting hard targets, numbers, because the whole perception of quotas. And I think companies have aspirational goals. I think you'll see an exec comp. Some companies will have strategic objectives on top of their financial goals. So many of those companies who went down those paths are still having strategics, but they're now calling them qualitatives or quants, right? Because they believe it. But I'm sure, Yelena, you've been advising on this and other pieces out of it, but it's definitely complex. I think it varies by company. Most companies that I work with are still philosophically on principle because the D&I is core to their cultural values, but they're being more cautious as they're working, so they have less litigation risk. But it's definitely challenging, and I know some people feel disheartened by it in what's happening. Others are kind of feeling relieved, right? So there's a lot of different things, but there's definitely been tension in the boardrooms on these metrics, and it's been hard. I mean, I had a very senior executive say that objective is going to wipe out some of our talented people because we don't hire enough to offset to get to that objective, right? So I think there's a lot of hard discussions happening, and I think it's the board often reflects some of the societal challenges that we don't want to necessarily want to say that, but it happens, right? But Yelena and others, I mean, please comment, because I think we're all seeing it at different aspects.
Yeah, Yelena, it would be good to hear a little bit about what you think the outflow from the Harvard case has been, because we are already seeing private lawsuits against companies, and sort of where is this going, and what is that impact of sort of paying off what Aubrey's been saying?
Thank you. It's a really important question, but just generally to set the ground, I don't like abrupt movements, right? So if a company was taking a certain path, if you will, in terms of diversity, in terms of ESG points, you can't just abandon them and say, oops, we didn't mean that. Like, it doesn't work like that. So, and you can't really remove the D&I policies. So I haven't seen that drastic movement, if you will. What companies absolutely should do in light of the Harvard case is look at their policies and see how they're phrased and what they're actually saying to make sure that the tone of these policies is aligned with the current legal thinking. So you can't say, and I'm making it up, but you can't say in your policy that we are targeting to have, I don't know, 20% of our workforce to be racially diverse or to have minorities. You can't have these targets that Aubrey was talking about, but you can have the aspirational goal of having the culture of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Even in the Harvard case, they were saying that the case is not about not allowing race as being one of the considerations in terms of the person's experience. So when you're looking at your pool of applicants or kids who want to be admitted to college, they can absolutely talk about race and how it influenced their life and their experience in a good way, in a bad way. But you can't have race as a factor that so you will sort of like check the box and say, because that person is racially diverse, he is a better applicant. So it can be part of a total mix of information. And the same attitude can be applied to employment decision to promote somebody. So you can absolutely think about diverse pool of employees and offices and board members and what their holistic experience, life experience brings to the table. So that idea is not off the table, if you will, or off the discussion. So I would encourage companies to look at their policies and think through how they're aligned with the Harvard case dicta, if you will, but not necessarily abolish the diversity as a goal. These are two very different things. In the same way, when we talk about ESG, so there was a recent Wall Street Journal article that basically said that ESG is a dirty word now, a dirty acronym. But ironically, when you look at some of the studies that have been performed on sustainability reports, there were, I think they were saying 8 companies that added ESG to the heading of their report, to the title of their report, and 5 companies that removed it. I don't think, again, like that you have to sort of like move very drastically and say that I'm going to add something or delete something. You need to figure out what works for your company. And it's really difficult to do that in this environment because it's so politicized. So for example, when the Harvard case came out, 13 state attorney generals sent a letter to Fortune 100 CEOs and said, you should absolutely not consider race as part of the considerations in your employment strategies. And then 21 AGs said, no, absolutely stay the course. So for companies that operate across the country, it's really difficult to figure out what they need to do. They can't really run after each political statement, especially this year when it's going to be the campaign year and every party is going to have its own agenda, if you will. You need to figure out what works for your company, reflected in your policies and procedures, and then reflected in disclosures. The SEC disclosures in proxy statements or in any other filing, they do not create reality, they reflect reality, right? So first of all, you think through what makes sense for the company, then you create policies and procedures that reflect your strategy, and then you create disclosure that reflects these policies and procedures.
Kevin, this feels like, another place for more active shareholder engagement. And I realize we're getting kind of late for some in the season as we go into the season full force. A lot of that happened in the fall. But the anti-ESG sentiment that applies clear to climate as well and other environmental policies is there. And sort of how do you think about that from a longer term set of company strategic goals and consistency in how you talk about things? I feel like that's one of the things we've been hearing is you pivoting from one place to another isn't going to serve you well. And again, this goes to the points that Aubrey and Elena were both making, but love your perspective.
No, I think that's absolutely right, Gloria, in the sense that, changing simply by the whims of the change in environment doesn't necessarily dictate a winning strategy. It may be for the time period, but you do have to take it back up a level. And you do have to really kind of consider then what is really moving the needle to performance. Because ultimately, that's what your stakeholders care about. I mean, so they would like you to do all the right things. They would like you to be thoughtful in the principles that you develop for the reasons you develop toward the performance outcome of the company. So all of that chain can't be disrupted by any whim or any political movement at a particular time, because ultimately that doesn't create value. And I think creating value is ultimately what we're here for, and really what people get measured against, both in terms of companies, boards, practices, et cetera. And I think taking the time to be thoughtful in terms of the principles that really contribute toward that end, and that may cause some change, that may cause some, shaving of or directionally redirecting some of the issues, but they should be aligned ultimately, and they should be longer term, because that's what we live for. And it should be toward contributing to ultimately the reason people invest in the company. And so if you have those things, I think that really should guide really what you're ultimately after from that perspective. And to do it by what's happening socially or politically, I think is a very risky game. And I think we've had some unbelievably stark examples, Harvard being one of them, Disney's another one of them, Budweiser's another one of them, that can really get whiplashed in the process. So.
Well, it's interesting on climate to see the calling out of some companies that have used it. It reminds me of other claims that people used to make, advertorials that would be published on various issues and things, but the greenwashing of, like claiming things, as opposed to if something's authentically attached to your both short and longer term strategy, to your goals, and that's how it's playing out, and in your conversations with your shareholders and in how you disclose through your proxy, which is really your best opportunity to tell your own company's bespoke story, then it's back to you having been the first activist at the table as a board. So that's kind of what I'm hearing. And I think one of the admonitions we've heard often from some of our guides, like Elena and Aubrey, is consistency across the board. You can't suddenly be saying, I'm authentically doing these things. And you can't also be saying, well, they were authentically part of our strategy and otherwise, but now we've yanked those away. So that gets me to one last question sort of in this category, which is around corporate political responsibility, because companies have gotten out in front of a number of issues, and they make contributions to certain elected officials, and that speaks volumes about who they are and what they're standing for. And some of that you understand, but there is significant added financial and brand reputational risk attached to these things. And I'm sort of wondering, again, from your experience, how you think about that and about how CEOs can do the right thing in specific instances, but maybe check some of their views at the door otherwise, particularly going into this year.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the right approach. I mean, I don't know of any company that I've been associated with that hasn't had, if you look at it in terms of its customer base, 50-50, 60-40 splits in terms of where their customers lie. And so, you know, my counsel is managements should take the lead, but they should consider their approach relative to the base that they serve and the constituents that they serve from that standpoint. So ultimately, what you don't want to do or what you do want to do is not really kind of upset the core stakeholders. Budweiser is the one that comes to light. We go from leading the nation to second or third in that kind of approach, and it happens in 90 days. And so again, I think it's just start with the principles of what you're trying to do. I personally, with all of the companies we've been associated with, you have to be smart, particularly in terms of the investments that you make. That includes the contributions that you do. It's all public information today. And so everybody's going to see what you do and who you're giving to from that standpoint. So be smart about what you're doing. I recognize, I mean, if I had a perfect world, I wouldn't do any of that. But it's not a perfect world. And I did when I was CEO, so I get it. But you just really just have to be mindful of all of your constituents, because they all see it and they're all evaluating you, some of them on that criteria.
And isn't this a place where boards and management need to be aligned, so one player doesn't get out ahead of where sort of the board might say, you know, maybe let's hold back a little bit on this?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's one of the core things that a diverse, skill-based board could do, is ask the right question, be the first activist, saying what are we doing and why are we doing that, and what's that look like in the context of everything that we're doing, and what's the story, and let management really kind of articulate exactly what their strategy is and why they're doing it from that standpoint. And that should be pushed back and forth so that you get to that right answer.
So Aubrey, I know we're getting a little bit short on time, but I definitely want to go back to executive comp for 24, because there's several things that I know you are thinking about beyond PVP and clawback rules that are impacting your clients. And you have such a rich repository of and such a bead on what they're maybe agonizing over this season. So if you could touch on that, it would be terrific.
Yeah, the biggest thing we're seeing, and especially on my client base, is companies are struggling setting goals in 24. You know, so if you almost, as a director and even as a consultant, you always kind of pause and say, look at how bonus plans have historically paid out. Look at goal setting. Look at the economic cycle, right? So you look at 2020, COVID hit us. We thought the world was ending. We went into a short recession. 21 goals that were set were probably low because we had no expectations of the bounce back. Most companies crushed their bonus plans in 21, right? Because of pushback. 22, you've had a great 21 now. So management's more opportunistic. The board is saying set the goals higher. Goals were higher. So 22, pretty good year, but bonuses were down year over year from 21 because 21 is an amazing year. We think 23 is going to be another down year. But remember, 21 was the high watermark. When you start paying below target, people start getting nervous. I've never had so many clients in 23 paying below target. Okay. For all the critics of exec comp, right? Oh, it never happens. Oh, come join my client base, right? Right. And this is across multiple industries, right? So what's happening in 24 now, as you have multiple years of bonuses being down, you can start damaging the franchise, the broader population, the employment brand. People who we want to recruit heard that, oh, you've had 2 years of lower bonuses, below targets, right? So as a board and as a compensation committee, you really want to challenge to set challenging goals, right? You want that, but how do you still motivate and retain employees? right? So budgets are going to be challenged with some of these companies. So let's say if we go to 24, how do you kind of preserve the employment brand, still have shareholder friendly programs? And I think you set your budgets for what you agree on. There's going to be some debate on that. But I have clients that are having softer downsides, flatter curves. So you're not slipping off it to zero as quickly as you did. I mean, I got clients that are S&P 500 clients that might have zero bonuses, right? And the share prices were up because we saw what happened in the last few months, right? So we're now in a situation where, there's the likelihood or potential the Fed's going to lower rates. So there's economic optimism, but these companies haven't seen it yet. You haven't seen the wind behind them yet. So I think it's a real challenge for boards to set the right goals, but design the program such that, hey, if you really had it out of the park, you can do well, but make sure you don't slip off the slope, because you will damage the franchise brand if you have, 2 years or multiple years of lower, and this is broad employees and executive bonuses, right? And it's going to vary by industry. Some industries have less bonus driven, but more and more of our industries are human capital driven industries. So we have to be really, really careful about that. That's the bonus side. On the long-term side plans, we're seeing companies, there's a shift since COVID on, we used to set 3-year goals, more companies setting 3 one-year measurement periods because of the uncertainty. That will likely continue. Proxy advisors want true 3-year goals as you set stuff. So these are all the balances boards have to have. And I think it's good to have engaging discussions with management. And, I think it's a balance of all these things, and it's delicate because if we don't do it right, I think there's definitely franchise damage that could occur out. And I have some direct competitors where one is harder and one's easier. And I think the one that's a little bit easier is going to probably benefit in the long run, because I think some of the others might be more damaged as companies coming out of this. So that's one of the issues, many others, but I know we're running out of time, so I will let you pick up to any other topics.
Well, just a quick comment on the inclusion of ESG measures in executive comp. Just that's the trend line has been moving to more companies doing so. And I'm just sort of quick view on from your expert perspective.
So I think roughly in the S&P 500, 75% have been putting in sustainability, if you don't use the ESG word, are putting different metrics in. What's interesting is the small and mid caps, the pressure started slowing down in 23. It's completely off in 24, right? So, but I definitely have some smaller and mid cap companies have put in D&I objectives because it's core to that culture. So it's going to vary, but I think those metrics are very much here to stay. But the question is, how detailed are some of those disclosures out there and those goal setting and aspirationals? But it's there. But I think the smaller and mid caps, the view for the bigger investors in the early days in 21 and 22 was, we'll push the big companies and flow down, but they'll stop pushing. So it's not going to flow down, right? And I think it's going to vary by company and culture.
But in D&I think it's also important to see how these compensation goals are phrased, right? So you can't really tie them to, we hired X number of people, so that's why you get a bonus.
Good point. So Yelena, around governance, I mean, we know this is the apolitical part of the string of ESG, and 75% made their way to the ballot last year, even though only a relatively few shareholder proposals passed. What do you see as by way of sort of the traditional and maybe less traditional governance items on the agenda this year?
So there is a set of topics that usually makes its way on the shareholder proposal slate. So executive compensation is one of them. Governance is another one. And the third one is the combination of E&S issues. The interesting one this year was about the independent chair. Not all of them were successful, but there was a lot of focus. It's a topic that has been of interest to the SEC for quite some time, and on the books you have the rule that you have to disclose if you combine the chairman of the board and the CEO roles, and if you do that, you'll have to explain why, and you will also have to have a lead director. So some of these proposals were not particularly successful because companies that don't have an independent chair usually have a very strong lead director. So you can see that the activist shareholders, when they put together these proposals, they usually pick an issue, if you will, and they zero down on that issue, not always taking into consideration what companies have been doing. And going back to what Kevin said, like you should be your own company's first activist, you need to understand your own vulnerabilities, right? You need to understand what the governance trends are. That's why, quite frankly, I feel that practicing the securities laws and corporate governance now is, quite frankly, way more interesting than it was more than 20 years ago when I started. Because at that time, the most thing that you asked to do is to do the rules check, right? So look at the rules, look at our proxy statement, and tell us whether we comply with the rules. If you're still doing that, you're way behind the pole, if you will, because that practice is all about the trends. You need to understand and read these tea leaves, right? What different constituencies are saying, what's important to them, and how your proxy statement and your policies and procedures reflect that. That's the practice, that's the focus. And if you understand that, and if you understand where your company stands there, it will be easier for you to evaluate how vulnerable you are, if you will, to activists' proposals.
And if you're listening and talking to and listening to your top shareholders.
Absolutely, they're one of the main constituencies, of course.
A key
Absolutely.
category. So I have two things that are sort of going to move us into a lightning round. And the first, really quickly, is, we've already touched on investor activism through universal proxy, but through broader conversation. So if there's anything there, Yelena, I would just ask you that is really pressing to say beyond what we've already talked about. And then I want to make sure that, and do you think AI is going to finally work its way, not finally, but because of the accelerated pace for companies, is that going to make its way sort of into the broader shareholder world, both activists and shareholders? And then it would be really great to truly be a lightning round if you could then, we'll have each of you give a couple of top takeaways from today's conversation for our audience. But if you could say something about activism that we've not covered, and what do you think about AI eventually at this stage making its way into the conversation?
So I think that AI is already there. Like, it's not making its way, it has made its way. And if the board is not focused on the company's AI use or the employees' use of AI, again, you're behind the pole. Like, I think you need to understand how the company is using it. And quite frankly, a lot of companies have been using it for a while. But what's new is the generative AI, right, that can produce content. And a lot of companies are now thinking about putting together policies and procedures. It reminds me years ago when social media was a new kid on the block, and companies were putting out policies in terms of how employees will be using social media. It's sort of like the similar idea, just a different technology. But you can't ignore that. You absolutely need to embrace it. You need to figure out which committee on the board is going to oversee your risk and opportunity related to AI, and treat it just as a new issue that the boards need to grapple with.
So that's the board active. So that's the board being its own activist at the table. Do you see it potentially making its way through activist shareholders this proxy season? I guess that's what I'm sort of waiting to
It could
see.
be, but quite frankly, it depends on where the focus will be. And as important as activist shareholders' actions are, I actually would love to step back from that, because again, the company needs to, going back to what Kevin was saying, the company needs to think about its performance. They're in the business of making money. How are they making money? Do they have sound policies of actually generating revenue? And then whatever activist shareholder thinks is sort of like secondary to that. Because if you start focusing on the trends of activist shareholders and you forget about the company's performance, it's going to be a disaster no matter what, even if you have the best tactics related to activist shareholders. So focus on the strategy, focus on what the company is designed to do, whether you're actually following your strategy. Make sure that your strategy is reflected in your SEC filings, in your proxy statement and 10K disclosures. Make sure that your board composition reflects your strategy and that the combined skill set is aligned with your strategy. And then think through how best to describe it. And then we worry about activist shareholders. So it's not sort of like the top concern, quite frankly, for the board. It's something that you should not forget about. It's something that you should be aware of, but it should not be the guiding post, if you will, of everything that you do.
Makes total sense. So thank you for that. A great stopping point, other than to ask you, now I'm going to say one takeaway that you think is really important for our audience. Aubrey?
I mean, I think it's, especially for all board members and comp committee members, it's all about pay and performance, right? If that's the core guiding principle. On the performance side, all the board, can influence that. You want strong company growth, revenues, profits. You want outperforming peers. You do all those things, the activists are in the background, right? There's not much energy. You start stumbling in some of those things and you falling off pay and performance, and it's not aligned, say on pay, everything starts to creep up, right? You want to, if you can just really focus on that and you let management, motivate management and align them with shareholders, it really gives them the freedom to design the programs you want, right? But if you focus on that one guiding principle of pay and performance, that kind of will guide you to where you want to go. And that's kind of your one beacon that you can use as a committee and as a board member.
Thank you. Perfect. Kevin?
I think the one thing that we haven't really had a chance to talk a lot about today that I think is really relevant, more so today, just because of all the dynamics that everyone has talked about in this program, and that really is the board's culture. Cultures are rarely neutral. They're either positive or negative. And I think that a lot of boards should recognize the work necessary to bring, on average, 12 people together to really solve problems, really develop and support strategies, have principles. That's not easy work to do. And I think that the time and energy that you spend as a board defining really what the culture is to optimize the outputs, I think are really, really something that probably could be a whole chat on itself, because it's really critical, I think, ultimately to the effectiveness of boards going forward. So that'd be the one takeaway for me.
Terrific. And I think it also goes to how you share your narrative. I mean, culture it all starts and ends with culture. And again, in conversations with your shareholders, obviously, and how you portray through your disclosures, it should come through loud and clear. Elena?
Well, I would say if there is one takeaway, it's watch the trends, right? So I was saying that my practice has become more interesting because we now watch the trends, not necessarily just follow the rules, but the same is true for the directors. And you can't come to the board meeting and sort of like expect management to feed you the rules. You need to come to the board meeting being ready to ask questions about these rules and already understanding the subject matter of these rules, maybe not the exact language, maybe not to the last point of whatever the regulation SK says, but you need to understand the gist of it, and you need to understand your role in the oversight over the implementation of these rules. So it makes your job, quite frankly, more difficult. But the fact that more than 100 people showed up at 7:30 and stayed for an hour and a half to listen to this program shows that you're already doing that. So congratulations.
Well, what's not difficult is for me to tell you how fabulous you've all been. And now it's my opportunity to turn this back to Melissa to close out the show, but I can't thank you all enough.
Okay, well, I took about a tablet's worth of notes. I know I wrote as opposed to did it online, but it was amazing. So a huge thank you to Yelena, Aubrey, Kevin, Gloria for this amazing program. I mean, tons of information to take with all of us. And for those of you who don't know, I'm Melissa Ludwig. I'm the board chair for the NACD Philadelphia chapter. And I'd be remiss without acknowledging our New England partners and how amazing they have been through the anniversary of these events that we've been putting off. I think this is now our third year doing it together, and it's been really, really special. And also, we have an administrative group here that keeps us on the straight and narrow and manages us. And I just really want to thank Deb, Kristen, Larissa, and Elizabeth, who are online today. But it's with their help and guidance and support that we are able to put these programs together for all of you. So a big thank you to our speakers, to the New England group, and certainly to our administrative group. But also to our sponsors, because as you know, we can't do it without all of you. So I just want to reiterate that. So we have a lot of upcoming programs on both sides of the fence. Please make sure that you guys were in Happy New Year. We're in hygiene mode, as Kevin puts it. But we have a number of events that are coming, and you're seeing up to February, but there's a lot more behind it. Please make sure that you're again, to be current, to Yelena's point, we hope to be bringing you the current topics that you need to know about. If you don't see something that makes, sense to you and you need more, let us know. And NACD obviously has tremendous resources for all of you. Finally, we love your feedback. There is a survey that was put into the chat. Please make sure that you're giving us your feedback so that we know how to best support all of you as we move forward. So thank you all for attending this morning. We don't want to take any more of your time, and we look forward to seeing you at our next sessions. So again, thank you all for joining us, and to our great speakers. Have a great day and shovel out.